My presentation, I think, follows very much on Levente's very important overview of what civic initiative and public civic cooperation can do. It's also something that we as a practice have been looking at for a very long time. And I think in a rapidly changing world where we see massive challenges and an increasingly dispersed landscape of actors, public, private, civic, we need to think about new types of tools and ways of working in order to enable mass collaboration. My practice does all sorts of things. I'll say a little bit more about that later, but we work across architecture, open source construction, management of community co-working platforms, and things like public realm design and strategic consultancy. And when I was reading some of the material that the organizers kindly sent to me about the urban charter that you're generating, I was struck by the sense of massive and intractable problems that you have in managing both growth and unplanned growth and rapid suburbanization around, say, Vilnius, and decline. And there was this sense of overwhelming complexity of the challenges that you have. And what it reminded me of is just one example, and it's kind of bad practice amongst urbanists nowadays to cite examples of Barcelona, but this I think is relevant. This is where my wife grew up. She didn't grow up in the 60s, but she grew up in Barcelona, on the outskirts of Barcelona in the 1980s, and actually it looked very much like this. You had the results of rapid development, rampant and unplanned real estate development, blocks of flats, bits of urban infrastructure, roads, some shopping, cars everywhere, and no good public space. These pictures are from the 60s and 70s, but in the 1980s, this was still the case. She played amongst the rubble, she walked through school amongst the garbage, etc. That was Barcelona in the 1980s. And we all know that in a relatively short time afterwards, these issues were overcome, right? Barcelona, and not just the center of the city, but also the outskirts, the former messy, ugly, chaotic periphery, now has urban parks and urban playgrounds and better routes and better public transport. So overcoming these massive urban challenges that you're facing, it has been done before, but it's not very likely to happen like Barcelona again. The massive, coordinated, top-down urban design, planning, and an architecture that cities like this have undertaken is unlikely to happen in the same way again because of, frankly, budget constraints. Spain is not doing it like this anymore. But also because we've understood that actually planning this top-down, it doesn't always work. And even, actually in Barcelona there was lots of civic input at various stages, but nevertheless. So you will find a different way. That's okay. You have an opportunity to do things fundamentally differently. And I think that's the opportunity that I'd like to speak with you about. So our thinking as a practice, as a 0-0, is coming from, having done architecture. This is working great, by the way. Levante? Thanks. We run a series of co-working spaces that have become civic platforms and platforms for experimentation in terms of social enterprise, social finance, and supporting startup entrepreneurship. And as we managed these spaces, and founded new spaces, we increasingly had a need for furniture, and we started to experiment with digital manufacturing technology. So that table that you see, which is a very attractive table designed by a colleague of mine, is actually much more interesting because of how it's produced than because of the design. It's part of an initiative called Open Desk. And Open Desk connects designers and local fabricators and customers anywhere in the world. It's a massive digital distributed manufacturing initiative. And now, why would I talk to you about furniture? It's hardly relevant, is it, in terms of urbanism? Well, it is, because there's a series of principles underlying this which are about distributed working and distributed ways of achieving results that are relevant to cities. It's easier to ship recipes than it is to ship cakes and biscuits, which is to say, we have to share ideas and enable distributed use of ideas. We don't have to plan and execute everything from above. And like with OpenDesk and this distributed furniture, which enables local people to actually vary the ideas because it's all based on open source working, you can also do that with, say, house building, when we also have an initiative that we co-founded called WikiHouse, which has become a way of manufacturing housing using digital technology to enable local people to be in the driving seat of their housing production, which in the UK, where, by the way, 50% of homes are built by just 10 companies, is a massive issue. And we know the technology exists, right? This was perhaps news 5 years ago, but right now I am confident that all across Lithuania there's lots of local, distributed, digitally driven manufacturing capability, which enables you to put together a house and its infrastructure. And most importantly, local people can do it. Kids can even do it. This is real. This is not put in scene. This is kids hammering together a piece of a house. And that's also a global network. What that does, this is not just about technology. What that does is fundamentally changes the balance of power in how we create the built environment. All of a sudden, we're not just focused on the built environment being generated through financial capital only. It also is complemented by social capital. That's the story that Levente was talking about. One step further, and you can start to see how the planning system can be transformed by such digitally enabled ways of working. And we are now working on, and I'll mention this term again and again, a full stack of technologies from planning to finance to manufacturing to skills development to enable this to happen at a massive scale. So you create a whole new marketplace around housing. And similarly, you could do that around public realm. And similarly, you could do that around different types of infrastructure at different levels. And the point is that collective infrastructure, the stuff that we share in our cities, can become the result, again, of collaborative ways of working, right? The point about the all-American community barn raising of the 19th century and early 20th century was that it did two things. One, it created vital, shared economic infrastructure, right? A barn, the stuff that your livelihood depended on. The other thing it did is that it showed to a local community what it could achieve together. And therefore it created and it reinforced the confidence and the trust and the mutual trust and the confidence in collaboration in a local community. It's never just about what you produce in the city, it's also about how you produce it. And if the 20th century's big political battles were often about the democratization of consumption, enabling everyone to have lots of things, the 21st century really is about democratization of production, enabling everyone to be part of producing the things that matter to them. And that's, I think, where we're at in cities, so that we can actually create an economy that, unlike the corporate economy that we have in the UK, which is led by the few, we can actually have an economy that's led by the many in a democratic way, driven by, as was said in one of the introductions, driven by local people's aspirations of how they want to live. We wrote a book about this a few years ago already, called The Compendium for the Civic Economy, where, just like Levente, we tracked a wide range of examples which were about that. How can everyone's time, resources, intelligence, creativity, drive across the population, across towns and cities and villages, be generating the outcomes that we want. Instead of relying on, and this was done the book was written in the context of the economic crisis, where public sector money and private sector money was rapidly disappearing. So instead of relying on large-scale money, how can we create that more distributed logic? And the civic economy is really this point where new forms of entrepreneurship meet the values of civic society. And there's all sorts of examples that I won't go into, but what we're seeing is, again, local people growing their own food, local people creating extra lighting in a neighborhood that they find too dark because the public sector can't do it. This lamp, by the way, I mean, it's just a lamp, right? But you need to look at the little sign that says, this lamp is ownership of, it's a small village in the Netherlands, of our neighborhood association. If the lamp is broken, email lamp@neighborhoodassociation.nl. It's beautiful. But the point is actually what I say above. This is not just exciting and new and fun and interesting, but it's generating outcomes, social and environmental outcomes, that the public and the private sector on their own find it very hard to achieve, right? So whether it is healthy food and participation in that, whether it is new shared infrastructure to make our neighborhood safer on everyday life, or whether it is renewable energy, or whether it is in the context of that project on the right, which is called Granny's Finest, which brings together young fashion designers with lonely old ladies who have phenomenal knitting capacity, and it brings together these ladies in a space, 30 ladies knitting together and teaching young fashion designers how to knit more beautifully and effectively. And so it's good for these young fashion designers, but it's also brilliant for these older ladies because their skills and their experience is valued, and they're working together and they're part of an economic system as opposed to sitting alone at home. So it's generating outcomes, in that case, addressing the care crisis that we have in Western societies and loneliness and depression issues amongst older people. It's addressing things through citizen initiative that the public and the private sector find very hard to achieve on their own. But, and here's the big but, all these beautiful things that are vital and important and powerful and that are real and that are achieving outcomes, of course, are happening against a big picture of what I would call massive, overwhelming challenges. And this is what we need to reflect on. I love the local civic initiatives, but I also recognize that the scale of challenges that urban societies face in terms of environmental challenges or social challenges often seems overwhelming. So how can we connect that hyper-local with a system at national level that is fit for purpose to address these massive challenges? I mean, the example I use of the sense of overwhelming scale of challenges is just a picture. This is an island somewhere in the middle of the Pacific or Atlantic Ocean, far, far away from any human society, where recently some scientists went to have a look, and this is what they found, right? An enormous amount of plastic. So there's this overwhelming sense of things that are upon us, and the idea that often our responses are inadequate, right? Just to kind of stick with that, with the picture of that abandoned beach full of plastic, we're sort of in the middle, right? Where the dotted line starts. If we think that plastic, and for plastic in this case, read inequality or poverty amongst older people or obesity amongst younger people. If we think that these problems are bad now, they're going to get worse, right? We face a risk of runaway social and environmental issues. So our responses often feel inadequate. It often feels like an old world of planning is dying, but a new world of addressing these issues is struggling to be born. Of course, this is a very old quote, but I think it still applies to the moment in which we live. And I think part of the problem is that we've become obsessed with the small. We love, and I'm part of this problem, we love talking about how one entrepreneur or one coffee shop or one community garden is changing the world. Because we love a good story. As human beings, we love stories of people and heroic entrepreneurship and the way in which recognizable stories with a picture and a face change cities. But actually, of course, the reality is that change happens in systems. It doesn't really matter what this picture on the right shows. As it happens, it's about a very intelligent piece of research that showed in the context of Mexico how coastal fisheries, which local people wanted to protect, are caught in this web of relationships, and it showed how drug violence and gangs impact on fish stocks. Now, why would that be the case, right? That makes no sense. Well, actually, drug gangs and violence impact on a local community's sense of trust in each other, which impacts on their capacity to enforce informal rules around whether it's okay to fish more or less in an area, right? So unexpected causes have wide-ranging impacts on a range of issues. That's the point I'm trying to make. And as human beings and as urbanists, we often focus too much on individual stories and not enough on the bigger systems behind them. And this current craze for startups, civic startups or tech startups or social startups, is a typical sort of 21st century way of doing what we've always done as human beings, which is making complex issues quite simple. And so we're not necessarily used to inquiring what we in 00 call the dark matter of systems change and how we really make progress with these daunting challenges. And there's another issue, which is that, I don't know if you're familiar with Monty Python, the English comedy series, but you know, the Holy Grail, right? Civic participation has for a very long time been the Holy Grail of urbanism. We want people to participate. If only the bloody people participated more in our plans as urbanists, then everything would be okay, but they don't. They always seem to have other priorities. Well, maybe that's because as governments, we don't necessarily ask them the right questions or involve them in the right way, because like Leventis showed, if you create the right kind of frameworks and opportunities and places for participation, people do take part and they lead things and they bring enormous energy and drive. The UK government has for a very long time tried to get people to participate more, not necessarily with success. The Big Society program that the former Prime Minister David Cameron launched, and which, by the way, now is completely forgotten because with Brexit and other nonsense, politicians are too busy. The Big Society agenda was a concerted effort to get citizens to participate more. But they made some horrendous mistakes. They tried citizens to take the lead in writing local neighborhood plans that would be part of the formal planning structure for neighborhoods. Now, why on earth would you try and channel the creativity and energy of local citizens into writing a planning document that we all know ultimately requires professional knowledge, right? That is fundamentally the wrong thing. That is asking citizens to take the role of the state. That is asking citizens to behave like the planning system, which of course is the wrong approach, right? Citizens have amazing capacity, amazing capability, amazing potential to change our cities, but you have to value them as citizens and not try and turn them into a mirror image of government. So we have these philosophical problems that we've often encountered in the UK and in the Netherlands, where I often work in really addressing this urban challenge. And really what we're seeing is how the stuff that we love, great civic projects, is enabled or made harder by the presence or absence of a wide range of things under the waterline, as it were, right? It's an iceberg challenge. What matters is what you don't see. And that's what I want the discussion perhaps to be about today. What is it? What are the underlying frameworks that we need to enable the distributed creation of our cities that we want? And I don't know if you know a lady called Elinor Ostrom. She recently died, but she was the 2009 winner of the Nobel Prize for economics. She was actually the first woman to win the Nobel Prize for economics. And her work was all about the commons. So she said that the intellectual tradition of the 20th century was so dominated by this big division between East and West, and capitalism and communism, and the state versus the market, and privatization versus the welfare state, that we often neglected this whole tradition of institutions created by citizens themselves, collectives, cooperatives, various initiatives. And if we're really going to change the way we live, the way we learn, the way we're productive, the way we innovate, we need to refocus our attention on how we create institutions that enable collaboration. And I think that is the challenge where we're at. We need to continuously focus on institutional innovation in order to create the outcomes we want. And I think you have an amazing opportunity, right? Reading this draft urban charter, I read that you feel that you hardly have a planning system, right? That there's so many things and so many tools that are lacking that it's very hard to do what you want to do. But the good news in all that is that you don't have to copy 20th century systems, right? You don't have, like the UK has, an enormously sophisticated, well-developed, but dysfunctional planning system that you need to reform. You can leapfrog that. You can jump over a lot of the issues that we face in the UK and create a system that is fit for purpose for the 21st century, and that uses all the capabilities and tools that digital progress puts at our disposal. And I know from sort of speaking with some of you earlier that you have already done that in many ways, right? So your if I understand, your property register is already fully digitized, which is still not the case in some of the places where I work. So you're already on that track, and that gives you, I think, phenomenal potential. And I think what you could do with that is focus on this: outcomes-based urbanism. So focus your planning system and your urban design not on built form for the sake of built form, but built form for the sake of achieving the bigger outcomes that you want, right? Health, social, mental well-being, learning outcomes, etc. Because we know more and more about the cost of bad outcomes. These are just some examples of how the UK counts the cost of its social problems, right? Broken families, child protection, when a child is taken out of a family because the family is so dysfunctional, costs the state £65,000 per year. Unemployment, every person that's unemployed costs the system £10,000 a year. Every lonely older person who's isolated and isn't taken care of by friends or family costs the state £30,000 a year. If you know that, you can all of a sudden design interventions to prevent such outcomes and finance them on the basis of the cost you save. Now that leap, turning the cost of social issues in a way of financing interventions that change them, can change everything. Because all of a sudden, you can generate a system that finances these distributed small-scale citizen activities that impact on older people's well-being, on energy efficiency, on local health, on the basis of knowing what they'll save you as a society in the long term. And this is crucial, right? Because we've been very good at financing big-scale change, but the stuff that we value that is small-scale, under the radar, informal, spontaneous, creative, citizen-led, it seems that the two have never met, right? There's always that gap in between. And maybe, because of digital progress, there's now a way in which the two can meet in the middle. How could we do this structurally? At neighborhood level, we have worked on a pilot that really tries to bring together this potential for distributed ways of working around a very complex UK-based topic, which is, again, structural poverty and disengagement amongst children and young people. So working in a very deprived neighborhood, where actually we realized that the local government on their own can never solve this problem. There's also a series of local charities around there, each of which want to change the lives of younger people. They also, on their own, can never solve this problem. There's also schools, there's doctors, there's civic initiatives, there's private companies who want to work on this. Each of them, again, on their own, can never solve this problem. And actually, often, in reality, they compete against each other. They compete for resources, for money, for attention, etc. So in a neighborhood context, how can you turn that from a fragmented bunch of actors, each doing their own thing, to a concerted coalition of people working together? That was the challenge here in North Camden. We created a book about that. The point is, again, single interventions can seldom change systems, right? One community garden can not change the outcomes of a whole neighborhood, but a whole lot of community gardens and other projects and initiatives together can shift the outcomes in an area, right? It's complicated to do technical innovation, but it's much more complex to do social innovation. So you have to find these new ways of working together. I won't go into too much detail about this, but this was the point. From short-term interventions, we need to create the capacity across the system, whether a neighborhood or a planning system, etc. We need to create the conditions in which sustainable change can happen. And that is about enabling lots more people in lots more situations, first of all, to be aware of the key outcomes, to be aware of the kind of systemic nature of issues. So we need to create access to data, and we need to enable the stories behind those data to come out. That's what enables people in the context, say, of our neighborhood and child poverty to really make an impact. Second of all, we need to build shared intelligence, and we need to enable also citizens to be part of research. And we need to make these, the outcomes of that research open. And that's one of the things we did, right? Child poverty in the UK is incredibly complex, but you need to humanize it. And you can actually bring local people on a journey where all of a sudden you're researching and understanding these issues together. We need to create open data. We've already spoken about that. And we need to go to a different way of looking at, say, a city, where we don't just count the real estate value, let's say, or the tax base, but also count the long-term potential financial impact of health, of mental health, of learning outcomes, etc. Only if we account for the system as a whole will we actually be able to address it at that level. We need to enable people who work in the city to be accountable to each other. Whether private sector or civic sector or public sector, we all need to open up about the actions that we're doing and what impact they have on the whole. And we need to finance that form of collaborative change. So we need to put in place different financing structures that are able to capture what goes on. And in the UK now, you have things like social impact bonds, right? I don't know if that term is known here, but the example that I used earlier about the cost of broken families. In the UK, interventions to support families are now based on this principle of social impact bonds. A private organization, a bank or an insurance fund, will finance a series of interventions, and if these interventions work, the government pays them back of the money saved in the long term, right? So there's new financing tools that can impact on our social systems or our environmental system. Imagine, right? Imagine if we could pay for a park on the basis of how it enables people to be healthier. Right? Those are the kind of things that we need to think about. Because then all of a sudden, a whole new stream of finance opens up to enable you to do the things that you want to do. And we need to create platforms where people can come together as equal, right? Where the local government participates, but isn't necessarily the only organization in the driving seat, right? We need to create new horizontal organizations that work between civic and state. We spoke about the data already, but this last point is important. What are these spaces of change, right? I think it's very different seeing a project like this, called Urban by AAA in Paris, fantastic project. It's one thing to see them as a nice, temporary, meanwhile project. It's quite another, and Levente's point was really important about this, to see them as a new horizontal, low barrier place where actually people can come together and talk about the future of the city in a different way, right? New places where democracy can take place. New places where horizontal power relations between multiple actors are created. So my point, again, is that if we're going to change cities fundamentally, we need to have a full stack of combined policies. We need planning, we need finance, we need democracy, we need data, we need all these aspects to work together. So the cultural, the technical, organizational capacity of change makers all need our attention. Now, in that way we can really scale the creativity and energy and drive of people. How do we do this? The point behind this is that there's some very hopeful and supportive trends, right? We finally understand across society the power of distributed production. Right? The idea that citizens at scale can change cities was not accepted 10 years ago. Now, in places like the Netherlands and the UK, it's increasingly accepted. That's helpful. I already spoke about finance, right? The idea that finance can be outcomes-based or can be based on capturing a value is now increasingly understood. And it's not just a paper idea, it's also being used by large-scale institutions. We have amazing computation and data capabilities that enable us to do the background calculations and evidencing in ways that were unthinkable 10, 20 years ago. And we now accept that regulation is not just about control, but actually is about co-production and instant feedback through data. And governance, again, these outcome-focused coalitions where different organizations in one area choose to work together to solve a particular issue is now increasingly accepted. In the US, these are called impact coalitions. So, say, in a big American city where alcohol abuse is a massive issue, again, no single organization is going to impact on that. Not the state, not the church, not a charity. If they work together and if they find new ways of working together, then they can make a structural impact. Just to give some examples of that to end up with. In London, Transport for London, which is the organization that runs the underground, the buses, the roads, etc., commissioned us to do a piece on how they can enable citizens to change public spaces. So there's now a strategy which officially is adopted by the Transport Planning Authority that explicitly encourages and invites citizens to be part of a system where roads can be closed off temporarily, where the edges of streets can be planted with trees and flowers by citizens, etc. And they do that partially because they know that they cannot pay for all innovation, right? The city doesn't have enough resources to achieve all the outcomes it wants. So it needs citizens to play its part. That's one thing. But also they just recognize there's so much creativity and desire to do this that they should benefit from that. Again, distributed production makes so much possible. Huh? So we and local cities can do that. We worked with a very deprived, impoverished community in Bristol to actually create a furniture factory, because the local city council was creating a new office for itself and a new business park, and rather than paying £200,000 to a furniture manufacturer somewhere abroad to buy all its furniture, they decided to put that money instead in a local factory where local people made all the furniture that this business park and the new city offices needed. And now there is this local factory where people can produce their own furniture and produce their own houses, or house extensions even. Right? And if you think about the potential of this to create new supply chains, new economic growth and jobs opportunities through the way in which the city purchases things it needs, all of a sudden that is transformative. You can create and support economies in a very different way. In the UK, which has a massive housing shortage, it is recognized that that developers on their own will not be able to build the number of homes we need. They don't have the incentives to do that. But lots of small organizations can do that instead. So again, there's an understanding about distributed production. There's also an understanding, this is a complex slide, the point here is that if we're going to create new infrastructure, such as, and this is a project that we're working on, a new park on a disused railway in the center of London, the public sector doesn't have enough tax income to pay for this. It's not going to happen. It's not their priority. But what we can do is create a system where the homes and businesses that are benefiting from having a new park next door, because they will benefit from it, the value of these buildings will increase, they can fund that scheme purely on the basis of what's called tax increment financing. If the property taxes go up because the value of these buildings go up, the public sector is able to recoup some of that money and pay off the loan that it took on for the building of this infrastructure. This is a very, very standard technique used, for example, in Los Angeles to transform bits of the city, right? So we have these new financial tools that we can deploy to make change. We can create contracts around buildings that are not focused on how big the building is, but on the outcomes it produces, right? A hospital, architects tend to get paid on the basis of the cost of the building. What if architects didn't get paid based on the cost of the building, but on whether it actually makes people healthier or not, right? All of a sudden, there would be very different incentives around how a building gets designed and how it gets delivered. What if we could turn planning into code, right? Could we go from a paper-based planning system, like we have in the UK, to an online system where actually you get live feedback as you design, in this case, your house extension, massive issue in the UK, in a way that is much easier for applicants, which takes much less time to anyone and gives much more power to the planners, because ultimately they can get instant feedback based on these digital interactions, and that enables them to change the rules, improve the rules, etc. Right? Again, impossible 10 years ago, but now it's possible. Ultimately, this is the point. You need that full stack of policies, from regulation to digital infrastructure to performance-based outcomes to a new managerial culture around how to do this, ultimately to create a much more humane city. All incentives across a system in a city need to be aligned, and that way we can create very different cities. And I think you have a real opportunity to think about, this is a piece of work that we're doing, by the way, in Dubai, where they have these things called free zones, right? Free zones are places where enterprise is regulated in a different way, so that they can have different tax rules, and foreign companies can come in and establish themselves more easily. In the UK, this concept exists through enterprise zones, where companies in deprived areas get fewer tax rules imposed on them, and that way economic growth is supported. Now, you could create what are called regulatory sandboxes, right? Zones in your cities or in the countryside where you try a different set of rules. You try these different rules in a sort of designated environment to see what different outcomes could be generated. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, it's a pilot project. You know, nothing is lost. It doesn't set the wrong legal precedent. But you have the power to do that. And I think that enables you to really turn around, perhaps, some of the urban decline or rural decline situations. But you have to do it always in the combination of approaches. You have to think about your regulation, your data, your performance context, like what are the outcomes that you really want, the culture in the organization and the culture of collaboration that you create, and ultimately the ambition that you have for a human society. So, I think I've said this a couple of times now. You have an amazing opportunity right now to create a system that is truly fit for the 21st century. That leapfrogs traditional top-down planning, that really goes beyond the systems that have created nice new public spaces, but by and large have failed in Western societies to create the participation and the democratic city that we want. We can create policy frameworks and finance frameworks for what we call massive small urbanism, where big outcomes are achieved through the aggregation of many small interventions from the private sector, from developers, as well as from citizens. You can lead the world in this, because everyone is focused on trying to create this. And if you, as a country, and as a small country, have the ability to do this, if you put your focus on this outcomes-based planning and new finance infrastructures, you could lead the world, without a doubt. You could digitize your planning system, focus it around environmental performance or around social outcomes. You could unlock finance in the ways that we discussed and enable mass civic participation. None of this will be easy, but it'll definitely be worth it. Because as I said, creating new frameworks for mass, distributed, collaborative ways of working is where it's at. Right? That's what the whole world is needing to do right now. And to end up with another Spanish cliché, there is that saying in Spanish, caminante no hay camino, se hace el camino al caminar, which is Spanish for there is no existing path. You create the path whilst you're walking. And where it comes to planning and urban design and urbanism for the 21st century, that is where we're at. There are no set outcomes, but you have the power in your hands at this point in time to create a path towards the future. Thank you very much.